Evil empires have been central to the stories of Final Fantasy games from the very beginning of the series. But few can compare or feel as believable as Final Fantasy VII's Shinra Electric Power Company. Breaking away from a series tradition, which previously focused on medieval or fantasy settings, Final Fantasy VII opted instead for a more modern dieselpunk aesthetic, and as a result, its world didn't have monarchs or castles, but CEOs and corporations. And Shinra was the biggest, to the point of acting as the planet's de facto world government. At the centre of this all-encompassing, massive corporate enterprise was Shinra's shining jewel, a monument and testament to its ambition and power, Midgar, the city of Mako. As the location of Shinra's global corporate headquarters, as well as being a central hub for its military operations and research and development, Midgar played a crucial role throughout the entire compilation of Final Fantasy VII. In the original game, it featured as the setting of the initial portion of the game, and this sentiment was expanded upon to see Midgar serve as the focal point for the entire first entry in the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. But Midgar has also featured under different guises within Advent Children, Before Crisis, Crisis Core, and even Dirge of Cerberus. And it's because of this, as well as copious amounts of promotional material, that the location has become iconic. The curious aspect, however, is that despite Midgar featuring prominently throughout the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, serving as the setting for many of its key events, the actual history of the city itself and how it came to be was left rather obscured, especially when it came to the original game. It's only as the compilation built out that blanks have been filled in, as much of Midgar's history is hidden in world design or literal development documents. As a result, those who experienced just pieces of the compilation's overall narrative only got glimpses into its dark and fascinating past. Prior to the creation of Midgar and the authoritarian supremacy of Shinra, the world was a very different place. It consisted of a myriad of different nations, republics, and peoples, and it was home to a diverse population that lived in a state of relative harmony with the environment. In the past, this harmony was maintained by the Cetra, but after the arrival of an extraterrestrial being known as Genova and the subsequent conflict that ensued, the influence of the Cetra waned. Even though they still had extraordinary powers and could commune with the planet, what they lacked was numerical advantage, and as the Cetra struggled to maintain their population, other factions came to the fore. Unlike the Cetra, these other factions forewent the same relationship with the planet. They were oblivious to its wishes and focused on other areas instead, such as progress through technological innovation and a desire for material things. As their influence grew and the Cetran influence continued to decline, this led to negative traits coming to the fore that were incongruous with the desires of the planet. Some factions did cooperate, but divisions formed due to differing moral and ethical beliefs, and the desire to obtain things that were in possession of others. Whereas the Cetra were able to see the bigger picture and relate everything back to the desires of the planet, that was no longer the primary consideration. Harmony was instead maintained by distance and treaties. But as time passed and populations grew larger and larger, to the point of forming nations, these differences only continued to grow. The ownership of territory and resources therefore became much more important, as there was a need for leaders to ensure their populations were satisfied. And as one would expect, these various populations relied on technological advances to protect what was theirs and acquire what wasn't. It led to the various power-playing nations becoming stuck in a cycle where they sought the relentless pursuit of anyone or anything who could give them an edge over the competition. Shinra, then known as the Shinra Manufacturing Works, was such an edge. After exploring numerous industries, Shinra started to gain a reputation in the field of weapons manufacturing. Prior to this, They had been seen as a useful company in a variety of fields, but through the combination of present need and the quality of the goods they produced, and their frequency, their sphere of influence started to increase. As such, Shinra did what any good capitalist company would do. They doubled down and tried to increase their profits by producing not just more weapons, but weapons that were much more efficient at their intended task. Even though Shinra had nowhere near as much power as many of the nations and factions they supplied, those nations and factions began to rely on Shinra to fuel their war machines. But this status quo was the same across the globe. The opposition also required arms. So even though Shinra's reputation was strong, due to how siloed the planet was, they were no more or less important than any of their contemporaries that existed in other parts of the world. And this remained the case until Shinra made an extraordinary discovery. In the year of 1959, scientists from Shinra found a way to harness the planet's life energy known as the life stream. Through an innovative refinement process, they surmised that the life stream could be converted into a seemingly limitless supply of energy. This new energy form was dubbed mako, and after initial experiments turned out to be fruitful, Shinra went public with their discovery, and there was a mixed response. As the sole proprietor of the technology required to produce mako, Shinra had a complete monopoly over its production. And as even entire nations could not generate energy that was as pure or as abundant, it started to see a shift in the balance of power. There was also the socio-economic impact of the discovery. For a long time, the various societies around the world had been fueled by coal. And with there being such a constant need for this energy source, mines were established and settlements were built around those mines to ensure workers were satisfied and motivated. The discovery of mako started to place doubt in the minds of people whose livelihoods were reliant on coal, and it showed the power that Shinra held. They then leveraged this power to transform their business. It meant that although they would still produce weapons and experiment in other areas, their primary function was now that of an energy provider. And to make this quite clear, they renamed their company from the Shinra Manufacturing Works to the Shinra Electric Power Company. In the 9 years that followed their landmark discovery, Shinra continued to refine and build upon the mako refinement process, and by using their newfound capital, they invested heavy in research and development. It led to the invention of a plethora of new technologies and techniques, and this birthed the idea of a settlement being powered completely by mako. But Shinra knew they would have to walk before they could run, and initial steps were taken around creating self-contained reactors that could siphon enough power to create a self-sustaining ecosystem. After undergoing numerous scouting missions, the science team decided that the sleepy mountain town of Nibelheim would be the perfect testing ground for their first mako reactor. It was quite remote, with no major nation claiming ownership of the region, and should anything go wrong with their experiment due to the remoteness of the location, Shinra would have plausible deniability. The Nibelheim mako reactor was constructed in 1968, 9 years after the discovery of mako, and it was an unbridled success. The nearby town had all of its needs catered for, and it proved that mako was indeed a powerful energy source, and that Shinra's reactors had the potential to power their capitalistic ambitions. These elements added credence to the validity of what became known as the Midgar project, a program designed to create a safe and prosperous way of life through mako energy. But while that was the altruistic vision proposed to the public, Shinra spent time figuring out how they could leverage the supposed drawbacks of mako production to help fuel their expansion throughout the world. And that was because the Nibelheim mako reactor had produced some unexpected but intriguing results. Shinra saw firsthand, on a much larger scale, that harvesting mako not only rapidly degraded the surrounding environment, but it also led to a marked increase in not just monster numbers, but also their ferocity. The Midgar project was designed to solidify Shinra as more than just a company that bought and sold different commodities from established nations around the world. By using their now vast riches, They sought to buy enough land so as to create a fixed location that could be turned into a fortified, landlocked state. And with this state established, Shinra then had visions of using Midgar to posture against other established nations, and either acquire what they needed from them through negotiations and treaties, or much more forceful means, such as subjugation and flat-out conquest. To ensure Midgar served as a suitable staging ground for all of these ambitions, design was of the utmost importance. They needed a way of maximizing the output of their most valued citizens, while protecting them from the harmful side effects of the mako extraction process and from any would-be invaders. After numerous revisions, Shinra scientists and architects came up with the innovative floating plate system, with the idea being that Midgar would be split into two sections. The floating plate system was quite a literal description. A ring of floating plates was designed as the upper level of Midgar, and this feat of engineering would serve as the very embodiment of Shinra's technological advancement, and the comfort mako could offer. Outside of being suspended above the ground, everything about the upper level was designed to be spacious and luxurious. This was where Shinra wanted its elite to reside. As such, Shinra wanted there to be heavy emphasis on commercialization and the arts, and if this all went according to plan, it meant the public who lived there would want for nothing. But perhaps the most important part was that by being suspended above the ground, there was no chance of the citizens being exposed to the negative side effects of mako production. Underneath the floating plates was where the dirtier side of the extraction process was to be contained. This was where the full effects of the environmental degradation were to be hidden away. And due to how barren the land was expected to become, the underside of Midgar was to become home to the vast majority of the city's industrial and sanitation zones. Beyond this, the upper and lower sides of Midgar were designed to create a clear separation between the upper and lower classes. And with this being a rather literal metaphor, Shinra felt it would foster competition, as those below could look up and have a constant reminder that their life could be better. They predicted that by using this clear visual stimulus, those who ended up living in the slums, in the doldrums of Midgar, would be driven to try and improve their situation by working hard. And this would, in turn, then feed into the corporate ambitions of Shinra, who planned to serve as the primary employer of Midgar citizens. With Shinra having agreed their rather egregious plan, the next step was to find a suitable location. Due to the proposed scale of Midgar, Shinra needed to find a sizable plot of land where no meaningful superpower could stand in opposition to its construction. And it just so happened that they had discovered a mako hotspot in the northern part of the eastern continent. This was far enough away from Junon for them to proceed undisturbed, and with plenty of smaller settlements such as Calm close enough, it meant there was a natural supply of workers ready and willing to help. With these arrangements settled, construction first began on Midgar in 1969, just a year after the completion of the Nibelheim mako reactor, and the location turned out to be both a blessing and a curse. Due to its required remoteness, at the start of the project, even energy supplies needed to be transported to the site from external sources, as there was no active mako reactor available nearby. There were also safety concerns, so to protect the construction crews from monster attacks, a giant wall was established around the perimeter of the site. Soon after, the city's very first mako reactor, dubbed Mako Reactor Zero, was then built at the center of the site. It took almost a year for Mako Reactor Zero to then become fully operational, but once this happened, it served as a conduit for everything else related to the Midgar project by providing a reliable and limitless energy supply for the construction crews to leverage. This made other, quite labour-intensive tasks much easier to navigate from this point forward, and after the surrounding area was levelled and prepped, construction on the rest of Midgar was able to begin in earnest. It was during this time that the number of lodgings, workshops and settlements for the labourers on the ground level of Midgar increased. Each was connected with one of the proposed outer rim mako reactors, and due to the size and scale of these labour settlements, they ended up serving as a basis for what would become known as the slums and the individual sectors. Once each mako reactor was then subsequently finished, These settlements were then separated by large dividing walls designed to reduce the harmful effects of the reactors on the people who lived there. And to work along with the notion of the ground level serving as a place of sanitation, purpose-built garbage waste zones were established along the inside of the outer perimeter wall. With Midgar's underbelly proceeding as planned, and the 8 independent sectors taking shape, work began on constructing the pillars that would shoulder the burden of supporting the upper floating plates. By 1974, the upper section of Plate 1 was in place, and from this point on, Shinra placed all efforts on completing the remaining plates and finalizing construction of the transportation system that would allow Shinra's ecosystem to manifest as intended, and it saw them construct the motor expressway and also an intricate train system. By providing a quick transportation solution for the aspirational workers who lived in the slums but had managed to secure jobs in the city above, it gave people from the lower and poorer districts access to the abundant riches found on the upper plate, and allowed them to dream of improving their station in life. But on the flip side, the train system also provided easy access for the city's more affluent dwellers who wanted to experience what life was like amongst Midgar's poorer citizens. Construction on all 8 of the upper plates was finalized by 1976, and with all 8 additional mako reactors now operational, Midgar was essentially ready. But before its citizens could begin properly migrating to the buildings on the upper plates, disaster struck. Even though Shinra's scientists and architects had been diligent with their testing, Sector 6 ended up collapsing due to excess weight loading. It led to the outer portion of the plate and its motor expressway crashing into the slums below. Luckily, casualties from the event were limited, as the Sector 6 plate itself was not yet settled, but this disaster was the first sign that not all that glittered was gold in Shinra's city of Mako. As the goal of Midgar was to serve as Shinra's monument to the majesty of Mako energy, the collapse of Sector 6 was an undoubted setback in the city's construction plans, and it could have been perceived as a rather embarrassing event. But Shinra made no effort to repair the plate. The reasons for this were unknown, but it was telling that the company allocated zero funding to reconstruction, opting instead to let the devastation remain a scar on the city's surface and the slums below. With this mishap behind them, Shinra placed all efforts instead on populating the remaining plates, with the last piece of the puzzle being the unveiling of Shinra's brand new worldwide corporate headquarters. This would reside in Sector 0, at the center of the city, and it was designed as a huge, imposing building many times larger than any other structure in the entire city. This meant the Shinra building towered over Midgar and was visible from far outside the city limits. The intent was clear. This building served as an object of pride for its own citizens, but the power and capital of the Shinra Electric Power Company, clear and present for its rivals to see. During the initial few years of Midgar, life in the city was better than anyone could have possibly imagined. Suddenly, people had access to much higher quality of life due to Mako energy, and thanks to the amenities on offer, even life in the slums was markedly better than rural life in many other parts of the world. In addition, jobs in a variety of secondary and tertiary industries provided many, both topside and below, with stable employment, something that attracted a constant flow of workers to the city from across the globe. But life was, without any kind of doubt, much better for those who lived on the upper plates. They were able to enjoy the best kinds of leisure, comfort, and entertainment thanks to Shinra's technological achievements. And this was delivered by shops, theatres, parks, apartment buildings, and nightlife attractions, each unlike anything else the world had on offer at that time, and all in one place. It meant a spot on the upper plate was quite sought after, and as time passed, this notion only became more true. You see, even though life at ground level was still filled with prosperity, general physical and mental health started to become affected by the lack of sunlight and how desolate, polluted, and waste-filled the land started to become. But beyond that, there were a whole host of other problems that cropped up too. Though Shinra's public security force did maintain a presence for security purposes throughout the Undercity, it was not their primary purpose. and it led to numerous criminal organizations being formed who operated in Shinra's blind spots or were sometimes quietly endorsed by them. Some parts of the slums, like Sector 5 and 7, still ended up having vibrant and relatively safe communities due to mutual cooperation between residents. But sadly, these places were often the exception as opposed to the rule. More common were places like the seedy Wall Market, which operated under their own rules and were often run by local crime lords such as Don Corneo, who were supported by Shinra in exchange for information and other services. These aspects were compounded by ever-increasing capacity issues. Much of the Undercity's population was made up of those who had come to Midgar looking for their piece of the city's fortunes, only to find that moving up top was nearly impossible, a fact that only worsened as time went on, with more and more people competing for an ever-dwindling amount of space and employment opportunities. While some of this inequality was by design on the part of Shinra, these conditions were further compounded by the harmful side effects of Midgar's reliance on mako energy, something people from the slums were all too familiar with, as the effects the construction of Midgar had on the surrounding environment were profound. Sapping the lifestream straight from the planet with its mako reactors, the outskirts of the city quickly became as barren and lifeless as the ground underneath the plate, with the degradation eventually extending almost all the way to the town of Calm, the closest other settlement. The environmental degradation did affect the slums the worst though, but those who lived on the upper plate also had their share of environmental concerns. Any plants grown topside often withered and died quickly, leaving Midgar a rather industrial place to live, and the sky was permanently enveloped by a cloudy haze that blocked out direct sunlight. It was for this reason that those living in the slums often referred to the upper plate as the rotting pizza. Such was the dire state of affairs in this regard that Midgar needed to import nearly all of its foodstuffs from outside of the city, as there was no arable land to work with. And this meant the diet of the average Midgar citizen ended up consisting mainly of pre-packaged, processed food made for utility. By proxy, those on the upper plate had access to higher quality food, and this furthered the disparity that existed between the haves and the have-nots. Monsters were also a real problem. Throughout the world, monsters had always been present, but mako reactors and the leaking of mako energy into the surrounding environment proved to only exacerbate the issue. In more rural areas, monsters often minded their own business. Though attacks were documented on the odd occasion, they were often down to territorial conflicts or some kind of societal issues. But with the environmental devastation and pollution of their inhabitants by mako, the monsters in the area surrounding Midgar mutated, growing much stronger and much more violent. This led to a dramatic increase in monster attacks, both in severity and frequency, and travelling between Midgar and other towns and cities became a very dangerous endeavour. But to make matters worse, this danger affected Midgar itself. Monsters started to spawn near mako reactors, but there were also issues where the perimeter wall had fell into disrepair and Shinra had just chosen not to fix it. This state of affairs forced many who lived in the Undercity to carry weapons for protection. This was a problem, but one that Shinra was happy with, as long as it didn't spill into the upper plate on a regular basis. And this notion was emphasized by their own activities. Not every monster roaming Midgar was a victim of mutation through pollution. Some were the result of something much more sinister. In order to ascend to global supremacy, Shinra had to stay sharp and ahead of the curve. To do this, President Shinra went about recruiting the brightest scientific minds on the planet, such as Professor Gast, Dr. Hollander, Dr. Grimoire Valentine, a biotechnologist named Lucrezia Crescent, and of course, the soon-to-become infamous Professor Hojo. It was this group that was responsible for researching and developing the scientific and technological advancements that Shinra required to achieve its mission, and who in turn had the opportunity to work in cutting-edge laboratories with all the financial backing they could ever want. This no-limits approach did have serious drawbacks, however, as Shinra's science department was more concerned with whether they could do something as opposed to whether they should do something. They were happy to forego moral, ethical, and physical boundaries in the pursuit of knowledge. While none involved embodied this concept more than Professor Hojo, all shared a role. Experiments were conducted on both monsters and humans, and often involved testing the limits of Mako and its ability to enhance Shinra's militaristic ambitions. It led to a host of nightmarish activities that were conducted in the name of science, and inevitably, some of these horrible creatures that were the result of these activities ended up escaping, or were intentionally set loose to see what would happen. These abominations then roamed the slums, unbeknownst to many of the rank-and-file Shinra staff or the general public. Some of this was part of what became known as the Soldier Project, or Project Zero. This project was personally approved by President Shinra, as he knew that in order for Shinra to remain at the forefront of the arms race, they would need strong operatives. Project Zero was designed to deliver those strong operatives, with experimentation focused on creating superhuman soldiers who could perform incredible feats and render the technology of other superpowers almost obsolete. Although this ideal was one-dimensional towards the start, it ended up growing to become multifaceted, and huge amounts of resources within the Shinra Science Department were dedicated to fulfilling the objective. Some of the experiments were therefore conducted above ground within the Shinra building, but others, due to their clandestine nature, were conducted underneath the Shinra building in a purpose-built facility called Deep Ground. The initial outward perception was that Deep Ground, which had its construction finalized in 1976, was built to serve as a medical facility. But over time, the role of this facility changed to adapt to the needs of the company. And in its most sinister iteration, it was used as a covert place for Shinra to conduct its less than savoury research away from the prying eyes of even some of its top clearance-holding staff. Much of this stemmed from why Project Zero was established in the first place, and how it was required to evolve over time. Having conducted much research around the history of the planet, Professor Gast discovered some fascinating remains in 1977. But Gast mistook those remains for that of a Cetra, an ancient race that once populated the planet. They had established that the ancients, or Cetra, were the original stewards of the planet and lived in harmony with nature and the lifestream. And it was this hypothesis that led Shinra to believe that if they were able to create an ancient of their own, they would be able to use this ancient to locate a place found in their research known as the Promised Land, a place said to contain near infinite mako energy. The discovery of Genova's remains led Shinra scientists to therefore believe Project Zero could fulfill both objectives at once. They could create an ancient who could lead Shinra to the Promised Land, and that this ancient could then serve as one of these superhuman soldiers President Shinra was so desperate to create. The resulting collection of experiments was dubbed the Genova Project, and they saw cells taken from Genova and injected into humans at different stages of their development. To come up with the best possible results, the project was split into two branches, Project G, led by Dr. Hollander, and Project S, led by Professor Hojo. The difference between these two branches of study was in how the Genova cells were introduced to the human body. In Project G, they were injected into fully grown humans, but with Project S, they were injected into the fetus pre-birth. Though Professor Gast would ultimately abandon the project after finding out the true nature of Genova, the Genova project was in part a success, and it was for this reason that research around Project G continued within Shinra's Deep Ground division, as they believed it was an effective and sustainable way of achieving their wider goal. It just needed to be perfected. Project S, on the other hand, led to the creation of Sephiroth. However, perhaps due to the nature of how the result was accomplished, no further research was conducted in this area. With Midgar established and significant progress being made on the Soldier program, Shinra leaned more into its totalitarian capitalistic ambitions. President Shinra became fixated on finding and securing the Promised Land, and it led to an increased appetite in the spreading of their mako reactors throughout the world so that everything fell firmly under their dominion. While there were definitely many who appreciated the conveniences of life enhanced by mako energy, there was also a growing resentment towards the company because of the wealth inequality they had created, coupled with the negative environmental effects and its authoritarian brand of politics. Strife was also being caused at settlements like Coral, where people's entire way of life was being uprooted due to the ever-evolving energy requirements that meant their profession as coal miners was no longer required. But whereas regions like Coral relented and allowed Shinra to move in and construct a mako reactor, others did not. And perhaps the most prominent region who rejected Shinra's advances was Wutai. Wutai believed that Midgar's motivations were not altruistic. Even though they probably could benefit from mako energy production, there was a growing distrust around what Wutai would have to concede in return, and Godo, the leader of Wutai, was none too impressed by Shinra's delegation, who showed a distinct lack of respect. Shinra, though, were undeterred by Wutai's rejections. They were going to build a mako reactor whether Wutai gave them permission or not. And so, as Shinra felt their forces were superior, and with them having grown frustrated by Wutai's stubbornness, the two parties went to war in 1985, just under a decade after Midgar had been completed. Shinra ultimately believed that Wutai would crumble under their might, and that this conflict would serve as the perfect opportunity for them to flex their muscles on a global scale, showing the rest of the world how superior they now were. But the burden placed on Midgar during this period ended up being quite heavy. Even though the war was being waged on foreign lands, to ensure total victory, Midgar ended up being crucial as a base of operations. This became more and more true as time passed, with the conflict ended up being nowhere near as swift and decisive as Shinra had hoped. And energy production was pushed into high gear as a consequence, with the mako reactors needing to produce copious amounts of energy to fuel the creation of ever-powerful pieces of technology and weaponry. This led to a huge increase in Shinra's military capabilities, but the toll this process took on Midgar's population and surrounding environment was significant. And this was especially true in the slums, with the Undercity falling into an ever-worsening state of disrepair and anarchy. The increased consumption of the mako reactors led to the land becoming barren at a much quicker rate, and monster sightings became an all too regular occurrence. And as the conflict continued, despite their military advantage, these issues only became more pronounced. In the end, Shinra started to suffer from a general sense of embarrassment, and throughout Midgar, dissenting voices started to appear. It meant Shinra was now facing a war on two fronts, one in Wutai that related to physical strength, and one at home that related to morale. As with everything, Shinra used their expertise and resources to quell the dissenting voices as best as they could. Aggressive propaganda campaigns were rolled out across Midgar to spread anti-Wutai sentiment, and Shinra's General Affairs Department, specifically the investigations sector known as the Turks, were deployed to remove specific individuals who were causing a problem. These tactics ended up being effective with the vast majority of citizens, but there was a general sense of relief once Wutai was eventually subdued and then subjugated. The ceasefire brought about a new age of Shinra's complete monopoly over the world's energy supply, and it asserted their dominance as an unrivaled military power. But just because the leadership of Shinra had these advantages, that didn't mean there wouldn't be challenges. Some they cared to address, and others they did not. Wutai's army had been quelled, but small pockets of resistance started to form around the globe. Some of them rose from the ashes of the now Shinra-controlled Wutai, while others appeared much closer to home, and this ushered in a new era for Midgar. Thank you all so much for watching this video, everyone. My name is Darryl, and this has been the latest video from Final Fantasy Union. If you had fun and enjoyed the discussion, please support the channel by liking the video and commenting below to give us your thoughts on this subject, and by subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Any interactions you make really help us out, but they also help us to understand what you want to see from us. So if you like this kind of content and are excited for part 2 of this video, let us know. And if you want to see something else, let us know that too. You may also be intrigued by some of the other things we do as a channel, including our newsletter called Wark Digest. Every single week, we give thoughts and opinions on what's happening in relation to Final Fantasy. You can find us on Substack. Now, if you want to be part of an always growing and engaged community relating to Final Fantasy, check out our Discord. We have over 1,000 members, and much like this channel, the community is built on mutual respect and a positive appreciation for the franchise. A special thanks also has to be given to our Patreon supporters. Honestly, without them this channel would not be possible, so every episode is dedicated to them, and especially Benjamin Snow, the livestream, Gregory, Juan Jaramillo, Justin Dent and Sukin TDK were super special Onion Knight supporters. Honestly, we don't deserve the support you offer, but we are incredibly grateful. And to repeat, without your support, this channel would not be possible. If you'd like to support the channel though, consider becoming a member of Patreon. For as little as $3 per month, you get access to perks such as videos early, free from advertising, audio-only versions of our super long-form content, and voting rights to help us determine what our next major project should be. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.